A new study out Wednesday backs up what many of us may have been noticing for years. TV networks are covering women's sports less frequently than men. It also found that the coverage is just plain boring. Cheryl Cooky is part of the team that conducted the 25-year study on the issue at Purdue University. Cheryl, it's one I'm familiar with, working in that sports industry for a long time. One of the things the study says is that the sexist coverage is often subtle and difficult to challenge. So can you give us some examples of what those things are?
Yeah, so when we look at news coverage, you're watching SportsCenter, you're watching your local news, you might not pick up on the ways that sports coverage is still sexist. In the past, what we found in our study is that the sexism was overt. It was very in your face. It was featuring female athletes in very sexualized poses, focusing on beach volleyball players and commenting on their sexual attractiveness, naked bungee jumpers jumping off bridges. What we see today is a decline in that kind of coverage, but it's been replaced with a different type of sexism, more subtle, so that if you're just watching, you might not pick up on it, but for us as researchers, when we're looking closely at this, we pick up on these subtle differences, which relate to the ways in which women's sports are presented in very lackluster, matter-of-fact matter.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so for example, those of you that are familiar with regular news, the news is delivered in just this is the facts and here's what we know. If you watch sports news and particularly highlight shows, there's a lot of colorful language, really interesting verbal descriptors, excitement, commentary, voice intonations, explosive language, as you can hear me talking now, whereas women's sports are presented as the USC women's team are facing off against St. John. They'll appear in the tournament on Friday, and it's just the facts, and it's in a monotone matter.
Is this local or is this national? Because I would argue that ESPN has been covering and doing the women's tournament now, and if you watch that, that is covered with the intensity that CBS gives to the men's tournament. So are we talking more local?
Yeah, that's a great point. So our study looked at both local coverage in Los Angeles, the local affiliates in Los Angeles, as well as ESPN SportsCenter. And while we might see those differences in terms of the broadcast coverage, our study focused on the sports news and highlight shows.
Okay, so
when you're watching SportsCenter.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and there hasn't been a lot of change in that realm.
You know, one thing, and maybe this is just going too in-depth into it, sometimes a lot of the sportscasters, myself included when I was doing it, you don't know as much about the women that are being covered, so there is less that you add to it. That fits what you're saying about the bias, because we do possibly know less. I want to get to a couple other things. One of the things also was that more time is spent covering men's sport in general. Now, is that because there are more men's pro sports, there are more popular sports like the NFL, which seems to live above everything else, or is there a different bias to it as well?
Yeah, so I think part of it is just the dominance of the big three, men's football, basketball, and baseball. But the other component to this is when we compare fairly equitable sports like the NCAA men's and women's tournament, which happen around the same time at the same competitive level at least, we still see those similar differences with respect to the quality of coverage and the amount of coverage on the men's side versus the women's side, which is actually quite surprising when you look at the networks that are broadcasting those tournaments. Like ESPN, you might expect that there would be more coverage on those networks and their programming, because you would think they would want to promote their own events, but that's not always the case.
Is some of this, and maybe this might not be a good analogy, is some of this just what people like? The idea that people are drawn more to these men's sports. So the idea of, when I go to a movie theater, it may be better for me to get lima beans, but I want popcorn. It may be the right thing to do to serve the lima beans that are healthier, but I want popcorn because I really like it, and there's nothing wrong with popcorn.
Yeah, I like your movie analogy, because I think it speaks to. Yeah, no, I think it speaks to, though, but that kind of conventional wisdom exists in female-led movies as well. Like, no one's going to go and watch a movie that's all female leads, and we're seeing that change now in our society, where people are going to see blockbuster films like Ghostbusters and Bridesmaids and Wonder Woman. So I think that there's a way that the conventional wisdom needs to be challenged. And what we don't focus on, which we look at in our study, is the ways in which how the broadcasts of these news and highlight shows actually creates an exciting and visually pleasurable experience when we're talking about men's sports, and a very dull and lackluster and boring experience when we're talking about women's sports. And so this isn't just about knowledge of the game, which I would agree with you is definitely a component when we're looking at the commentary, but the news can certainly add in, news broadcasters can certainly add in that same kind of colorful language, like going in for the dunk and she's
well, the game is
dominating
different.
the
Yeah,
boards.
it's also the game
Yeah.
is different though. The women's game does not have that. If you're talking basketball, it doesn't have that same intensity. It's not above the rim. It tends to be a different game, and some of that comes from a physical game, and those may also be factors. Cheryl, I'm sorry. I hate doing this to you. We are out of time. It's a really interesting discussion, especially because over 25 years you've studied this. I feel like it would be interesting to dive into where it is now versus where it was when you first started it. Maybe we'll have to have you back.
Stay tuned in 2019 because we're replicating the study again then.
Oh, that's great. I look forward to it. Cheryl Cooky, thank you for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.